The Gallic War and the Civil War by Gaius Julius Caesar. Book 1, Chapter 1. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, those who in their own language are called Celts, in ours Gauls, the third. All these differ from each other in language, customs, and laws. The river Garonne separates the Gauls from the Aquitani. The Marne and the Seine separate them from the Belgae. Of all these, the Belgae are the bravest, because they are farthest from the civilization and refinement of our province, and merchants least frequently resort to them and import those things which tend to effeminate the mind. And they are the nearest to the Germans, who dwell beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually waging war. For which reason the Helvetii also surpass the rest of the Gauls in valor, as they contend with the Germans in almost daily battles, when they either repel them from their own territories, or themselves wage war on their frontiers. One part of these, which it has been said that the Gauls occupy, takes its beginning at the river Rhone. It is bounded by the river Garonne, the ocean, and the territories of the Belgae. It borders too on the side of the Sequani and the Helvetii, upon the river Rhine, and stretches towards the north. The Belgae rise from the extreme frontier of Gaul, extend to the lower part of the river Rhine, and look towards the north and the rising sun. Aquitania extends from the river Garonne to the Pyrenean mountains and to that part of the ocean which is near Spain. It looks between the setting of the sun and the North Star. Chapter 2. Among the Helvetii, Orgetorix was by far the most distinguished and wealthy. He, when Marcus Massalia and Marcus Piso were consuls, incited by lust of sovereignty, formed a conspiracy among the nobility, and persuaded the people to go forth from their territories with all their possessions, saying that it would be very easy, since they excelled all in valor, to acquire the supremacy of the whole of Gaul. To this he the more easily persuaded them, because the Helvetii are confined on every side by the nature of their situation. On one side by the Rhine, a very broad and deep river, which separates the Helvetian territory from the Germans. On a second side by the Jura, a very high mountain which is situated between the Sequani and the Helvetii. On a third by the Lake of Geneva, and by the river Rhone, which separates our province from the Helvetii. From these circumstances it resulted that they could range less widely, and could less easily make war upon their neighbours, for which reason men fond of war, as they were affected with great regret. They thought that, considering the extent of their population, and their renown for warfare and bravery, that they had but narrow limits, although they extended in length 240 and in breadth 180 Roman miles. Chapter 3. Induced by these considerations and influenced by the authority of Orgetorix, they determined to provide such things as were necessary for their expedition, to buy up as great a number as possible of beasts of burden and wagons, to make their sowings as large as possible so that on their march plenty of corn might be in store, and to establish peace and friendship with the neighboring states. They reckoned that a term of 2 years would be sufficient for them to execute their designs. They fixed by decree their departure for the 3rd year. Orgetorix is chosen to complete these arrangements. He took upon himself the office of ambassador of the states. On this journey he persuades Casticus, the son of Catamantalades, one of the Sequani, whose father had possessed the sovereignty among the people for many years, and had been styled friend by the Senate of the Roman people, to seize upon the sovereignty in his own state, which his father had held before him, and he likewise persuades Dumnorix, an Aeduan, the brother of Divitiacus, who at the time possessed the chief authority in the state, and was exceedingly beloved by the people, to attempt the same, and gives him his daughter in marriage. He proves to them that to accomplish their attempts was a thing very easy to be done, because he himself would obtain the government of his own state, that there was no doubt that the Helvetii were the most powerful of the whole of Gaul. He assures them that he will, with his own forces and his own army, acquire the sovereignty for them. Incited by this speech, they give a pledge and oath to one another, and hope that when they have seized the sovereignty, they will, by means of the three most powerful and valiant nations, be enabled to obtain possession of the whole of Gaul. Chapter 4. When this scheme was disclosed to the Helvetii by informers, they, according to their custom, compelled Orgetorix to plead his cause in chains. It was the law that the penalty of being burned by fire should await him if condemned. On the day appointed for the pleading of his cause, Orgetorix drew together from all quarters to the court all his vassals to the number of 10,000 persons, and led together to the same place, and all his dependents and debtor bondsmen, of whom he had a great number. By means of these he rescued himself from the necessity of pleading his case. While the state, incensed at this act, was endeavoring to assert its right by arms, and the magistrates were mustering a large body of men from the country, Orgetorix died, and there is not wanting a suspicion, as the Helvetii think, of his having committed suicide. Chapter 5. After his death, the Helvetii nevertheless attempt to do that which they had resolved on, namely, to go forth from their territories. When they thought that they were at length prepared for this undertaking, they set fire to all their towns, in number about 12, to their villages about 400, and to the private buildings that remained. They burn up all the corn, except what they intend to carry with them, that after destroying the hope of return home, they might be the more ready for undertaking all dangers. They order every one to carry forth from home for himself provisions for 3 months, ready ground. They persuade the Roraki and the Tulingi and the Latobrigi, their neighbors, to adopt the same plan, and after burning down their towns and villages, to set out with them. And they admit to the party and unite to themselves, as confederates, the Boii, who had dwelt on the other side of the Rhine, and had crossed over into the Norican territory, and assaulted Noria. Chapter 6. There were in all 2 routes from which they could go forth from their country. One through the Sequani, narrow and difficult, between Mount Jura and the river Rhone, by which scarcely 1 wagon at a time could be led. There was, moreover, a very high mountain overhanging, so that a very few might easily intercept them. The other through our province, much easier and freer from obstacles, because the Rhone flows between the boundaries of the Helvetii and those of the Allobroges, who had lately been subdued, and is in some places crossed by a ford. The furthest town of the Allobroges, and the nearest to the territories of the Helvetii, is Geneva. From this town a bridge extends to the Helvetii. They thought that they should either persuade the Allobroges, because they did not seem as yet well affected towards the Roman people, or compel them by force to allow them to pass through their territories. Having provided everything for the expedition, they appoint a day on which they should all meet on the bank of the Rhone. This day was the 5th before the calends of April, i.e. the 28th of March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius, B.C. 58. Chapter 7. When it was reported to Caesar that they were attempting to make their route through our province, he hastens to set out from the city, and by as great marches as he can, proceeds to further Gaul, and arrives at Geneva. He orders the whole province to furnish as great a number of soldiers as possible, as there was in all only 1 legion in further Gaul. He orders the bridge at Geneva to be broken down. When the Helvetii are apprised of his arrival, they send to him as ambassadors the most illustrious men of their state, in which embassy Numeius and Vesontio held in chief place, to say that it was their intention to march through the province without doing any harm, because they had, according to their own representations, no other route, that they requested they might be allowed to do so with his consent. Caesar, inasmuch as he kept in remembrance that Lucius Cassius, the consul, had been slain, and his army routed and made to pass under the yoke by the Helvetii, did not think that their request ought to be granted. Nor was he of opinion that men of hostile disposition, if an opportunity of marching through the province were given to them, would abstain from outrage and mischief. Yet, in order that a period might intervene until the soldiers whom he had ordered to be furnished should assemble, he replied to the ambassadors that he would take time to deliberate. If they wanted anything, they might return on the day before the Ides of April, on April 12th. Chapter 8. Meanwhile, with the legion which he had with him, and the soldiers who had assembled from the province, he carries along for 19 Roman, not quite 18 English, miles, a wall, to the height of 16 feet, and a trench from the lake of Geneva, which flows into the river Rhone, to Mount Jura, which separates the territories of the Sequani from those of the Helvetii. When that work was finished, he distributes garrisons, and closely fortifies redoubts, in order that he may the more easily intercept them, if they should at all attempt to cross over against his will. When the day which he had appointed with the ambassadors came, and they returned to him, he says that he cannot, consistently with the custom and precedent of the Roman people, grant any one a passage through the province. And he gives them to understand that if they should attempt to use violence, he would oppose them. The Helvetii, disappointed in this hope, tried if they could force a passage, some by means of a bridge of boats and numerous rafts constructed for the purpose, others by the fords of the Rhone, where the depth of the river was least, sometimes by day, but more frequently by night. But being kept at bay by the strength of our works, and by the concourse of the soldiers, and by the missiles, they desisted from this attempt. Chapter 9. There was left one way, namely through the Sequani, by which, on account of its narrowness, they could not pass without the consent of the Sequani. As they could not of themselves prevail on them, they sent ambassadors to Dumnorix the Aeduan, that through his intercession they might obtain their request from the Sequani. Dumnorix, by his popularity and liberality, had great influence among the Sequani, and was friendly to the Helvetii, because out of that state he had married the daughter of Orgetorix, and, incited by lust of sovereignty, was anxious for a revolution, and wished to have as many states as possible attached to him by his kindness toward them. He therefore undertakes the affair, and prevails upon the Sequani to allow the Helvetii to march through their territories, and arranges that they should give hostages to each other, the Sequani not to obstruct the Helvetii in their march, the Helvetii to pass without mischief and outrage. Chapter 10. It is again told Caesar that the Helvetii intend to march through the country of the Sequani and the Aedui into the territories of the Santones, which are not far distant from those boundaries of the Tolosates, which, viz. Tolosa, Toulouse, is a state in the province. If this took place, he saw that it would be attended with great danger to the province to have warlike men, enemies of the Roman people, bordering upon an open and very fertile tract of country. For these reasons he appointed Titus Labienus, his lieutenant, to the command of the fortification which he had made. He himself proceeds to Italy by forced marches, and there levies 2 legions, and leads out from winter quarters 3 which were wintering around Aquileia, and with these 5 legions marches rapidly by the nearest route along the Alps into further Gaul. Here the Cantrones and the Graioceli and the Caturiges, having taken possession of the higher parts, attempt to obstruct the army in their march. After having routed these in several battles, he arrives in the territories of the Vesontio in the further province on the 7th day from Ocalum, which is the most remote town of the hither province. Thence he leads his army into the country of the Allobroges, and from the Allobroges to the Segusiani. These people are the first beyond the province on the opposite side of the Rhone. Chapter 11. The Helvetii had by this time led their forces over through the narrow Defile and the territories of the Sequani, and had arrived at the territories of the Aedui, and were ravaging their lands. The Aedui, as they could not defend themselves and their possessions against them, sent ambassadors to Caesar to ask assistance, pleading that they had at all times so well deserved the Roman people that their fields ought not to have been laid waste, their children carried off into slavery, their towns stormed, almost within sight of our army. At the same time, the Ambari, the friends and kinsmen of the Aedui, apprised Caesar that it was not easy for them, now that their fields have been devastated, to ward off the violence of the enemy from their towns. The Allobroges, likewise, who had villages and possessions on the other side of the Rhone, betake themselves in flight to Caesar, and assure him that they had nothing remaining except the soil of their land. Caesar, induced by these circumstances, decides that he ought not to wait until the Helvetii, after destroying all the property of his allies, should arrive among the Santones. Chapter 12. There is a river called the Seine, which flows through the territories of the Aedui and Sequani into the Rhone with such incredible slowness that it cannot be determined by the eye in which direction it flows. This the Helvetii were crossing by rafts and boats joined together. When Caesar was informed by spies that the Helvetii had already conveyed 3 parts of their forces across the river, but that the 4th part was left behind on this side of the Seine, he set out from the camp with 3 legions during the 3rd watch, and came up with that division which had not yet crossed the river. Attacking them encumbered with baggage, and not expecting him, he cut to pieces a great part of them. The rest betook themselves to flight, and concealed themselves in the nearest woods. That canton which was cut down was called the Tigurine, for the whole Helvetian state is divided into 4 cantons. This single canton, having left their country, within the recollection of our fathers, had slain Lucius Cassius the consul, and had made his army pass under the yoke in B.C. 107. Thus, whether by chance or by the design of the immortal gods, that part of the Helvetian state which had brought a signal calamity upon the Roman people was the first to pay the penalty. In this, Caesar avenged not only the public, but also his own personal wrongs, because the Tigurini had slain Lucius Piso, the lieutenant of Cassius, the grandfather of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, Caesar's father-in-law, in the same battle as Cassius himself. Chapter 13. This battle ended, that he might be able to come up with the remaining forces of the Helvetii. He procures a bridge to be made across the Seine, and thus leads his army over. The Helvetii, confused by his sudden arrival, when they found that he had effected in 1 day what they themselves had with the utmost difficulty accomplished in 20, namely the crossing of the river, send ambassadors to him, at the head of which embassy was Divico, who had been commander of the Helvetii in the war against Cassius. He thus treats with Caesar, that if the Roman people would make peace with the Helvetii, they would go to that part and there remain, where Caesar might appoint and desire them to be. But if he should persist in persecuting them with war, that he ought to remember both the ancient disgrace of the Roman people and the characteristic valor of the Helvetii. As to his having attacked 1 canton by surprise, at a time when those who had crossed the river could not bring assistance to their friends, that he ought not on that account to ascribe very much to his own valor, or despise them that they had so learned from their sires and ancestors as to rely more on valor than on artifice or stratagem. Wherefore let him not bring it to pass that the place where they were standing should acquire a name, from the disaster of the Roman people and the destruction of their army, or transmit the remembrance of such an event to posterity. Chapter 14. To these words Caesar thus replied, that on that varied account he felt less hesitation, because he kept in remembrance those circumstances which the Helvetian ambassadors had mentioned, and that he felt the more indignant at them in proportion as they had happened undeservedly to the Roman people. For if they had been conscious of having done any wrong, it would not have been difficult to be on their guard. But for that very reason had they been deceived, because neither were they aware that any offense had been given by them on account of which they should be afraid, nor did they think that they ought to be afraid without cause. But even if he were willing to forget their former outrage, could he also lay aside the remembrance of the late wrongs, in that they had against his will attempted a route through the province by force, in that they had molested the Aedui, the Ambari, and the Allobroges? That as to their so insolently boasting of their victory, and as to their being astonished that they had so long committed their outrages with impunity, both these things tended to the same point. For the immortal gods are wont to allow those persons whom they wish to punish for their guilt sometimes a greater prosperity and longer impunity, in order that they may suffer the more severely from a reverse of circumstances. Although these things are so, yet if hostages were to be given him by them in order that he may be assured they will do what they promise, and provided they will give satisfaction to the Aedui for the outrages which they had committed against them and their allies, and likewise to the Allobroges, he, Caesar, will make peace with them. Divico replied that the Helvetii had been so trained by their ancestors that they were accustomed to receive, not to give, hostages. Of that fact the Roman people were witness. Having given his reply, he withdrew. Chapter 15. On the following day they move their camp from that place. Caesar does the same, and sends forward all his cavalry, to the number of 4,000, which he had drawn together from all parts of the province and from the Aedui and their allies, to observe towards what parts the enemy are directing their march. These, having too eagerly pursued the enemy's rear, come to a battle with the cavalry of the Helvetii in a disadvantaged place, and a few of our men fall. The Helvetii, elated with this battle, because they had with 500 horse repulsed so large a body of horse, began to face us more boldly, sometimes too from their rear to provoke our men by an attack. Caesar, however, restrained his men from battle, deeming it sufficient from the present to prevent the enemy from rapine, forage, and depredation. They marched for about 15 days in such a manner that there was not more than 5 or 6 miles between the enemy's rear and our van. Chapter 16. Meanwhile, Caesar kept daily importuning the Aedui for the corn which they had promised in the name of their state. For, in consequence of the coldness, Gaul being, as was said before, situated towards the north, not only was the corn in the fields not ripe, but there was not in store a sufficiently large quantity even of fodder. Besides, he was unable to use the corn which he had conveyed in ships up the river Seine, because the Helvetii, from whom he was unwilling to retire, had diverted their march from the Seine. The Aedui kept deferring from day to day, and saying that it was being collected, brought in, on the road. When he saw that he was put off too long, and that the day was close at hand on which he ought to serve out the corn to his soldiers, having called together their chiefs, of whom he had a great number in his camp, among them Divitiacus and Liscus, who was invested with the chief magistracy, whom the Aedui style as Vercobretus, and who is elected annually, and has power of life and death over his countrymen. He severely reprimands them, because he is not assisted by them on so urgent an occasion, when the enemy were so close at hand, and when corn could neither be bought nor taken from the fields, particularly as, in a great measure urged by their prayers, he had undertaken the war. Much more bitterly, therefore, does he complain of his being forsaken. Chapter 17. Then, at length, Liscus, moved by Caesar's speech, discloses what he had hitherto kept secret, that there are some whose influence with the people is very great, who through private men have more power than the magistrates themselves, that these by seditious and violent language are deterring the populace from contributing the corn which they ought to supply, by telling them that, if they cannot any longer retain the supremacy of Gaul, it were better to submit to the government of Gauls than of Romans. Nor ought they to doubt that, if the Romans should overpower the Helvetii, they would wrest their freedom from the Aedui together with the remainder of Gaul. But these very men, said he, are our plans, and whatever is done in the camp disclose to the enemy, that they should not be restrained by him. Nay more, he was well aware that, though compelled by necessity, he had disclosed the matter to Caesar, as how great a risk he had done it, and for that reason he had been silent as long as he could. Chapter 18. Caesar perceived that in this speech of Liscus, Dumnorix, the brother of Divitiacus, was indicated. But, as he was unwilling that these matters should be discussed while so many were present, he speedily dismisses the council, but detains Liscus. He inquires from him alone about those things which he had said in the meeting. He, Liscus, speaks more unreservedly and boldly. He, Caesar, makes inquiries on the same points privately of others, and discovers that it is all true, that Dumnorix is the person, a man of the highest daring, in great favour with the people on account of his liberality, a man eager for a revolution, that for a great many years he has been in the habit of contracting for the customs and all the other taxes of the Aedui at a small cost, because when he bids, no one dares to bid against him. By these means he has both increased his own private property and amassed great means for giving largesses, that he maintains constantly at his own expense and keeps about his own person a great number of cavalry, and that not only at home, but even among the neighbouring states he has great influence, and for the sake of strengthening this influence, has given his mother in marriage among the Bituriges to a man the most noble and the most influential there. That he has himself taken a wife from among the Helvetii, and has given his sister by the mother's side and his female relations in marriage into other states. That he favours and wishes well to the Helvetii on account of their connection, and that he hates Caesar and the Romans on his own account, because by their arrival his power was weakened, and his brother Divitiacus restored to his former position of influence and dignity. That, if anything should happen to the Romans, he entertains the highest hope of gaining the sovereignty by means of the Helvetii, but that under the government of the Roman people he despairs not only the royalty but even of that influence which he already has. Caesar discovered, too, on inquiring into the unsuccessful cavalry engagement which had taken place a few days before, that the commencement of that flight had been made by Dumnorix and his cavalry. For Dumnorix was in command of the cavalry which the Aedui had sent for aid to Caesar, that by their flight the rest of the cavalry was dismayed. Chapter 19. After learning these circumstances, since to these suspicions the most unequivocal facts were added, viz. That he had led the Helvetii through the territories of the Sequani, that he had provided that hostages should be mutually given, that he had done all these things not only without any orders of his, Caesar's, and of his own states, but even without their, the Aedui, knowing anything of it themselves, that he, Dumnorix, was reprimanded by the chief magistrate of the Aedui. He, Caesar, considered that there was sufficient reason as why he should either punish him himself or order the state to do so. One thing, however, stood in the way of all this, that he had learned by experience his brother Divitiacus's very high regard for the Roman people, his great affection towards him, his distinguished faithfulness, justice, and moderation. For he was afraid lest by the punishment of this man he should hurt the feelings of Divitiacus. Therefore, before he attempted anything, he orders Divitiacus to be summoned to him, and when the ordinary interpreters had been withdrawn, converses with him through Gaius Valerius Procillus, chief of the province of Gaul, an intimate friend of his, in whom he reposed the highest confidence in everything. At the same time he reminds him of what was said about Dumnorix in the council of the Gauls, when he himself was present, and shows what each has said of him privately in his, Caesar's, own presence. He begs and exhorts him, that without offence to his feelings he may either himself pass judgment on him, Dumnorix, after trying the case, or else order the Aeduan state to do so. Chapter 20. Divitiacus, embracing Caesar, begins to implore him with many tears that he would not pass any very severe sentence upon his brother, saying that he knows that those charges are true, and that nobody suffered more pain on that account than he himself did. For when he himself could effect a very great deal by his influence at home and in the rest of Gaul, and he, Dumnorix, very little on account of his youth, the latter had become powerful through his means, which power and strength he used not only to the lessening of his, Divitiacus's, popularity, but almost to his ruin. That he, however, was influenced both by fraternal affection and by public opinion. But if anything very severe from Caesar should befall him, Dumnorix, no one should think that it had been done without his consent, since he himself held such a place in Caesar's friendship. From which circumstance it would arise that the affections of the whole of Gaul would be estranged from him. As he was with tears begging these things of Caesar in many words, Caesar takes his right hand and, comforting him, begs him to make an end of entreating, and assures him that his regard for him is so great that he forgives both the injuries of the Republic and his private wrongs, and his desire and prayers. He summons Dumnorix to him. He brings in his brother. He points out what he censures in him. He lays before him what he of himself perceives and what the state complains of. He warns him for the future to avoid all grounds of suspicion. He says that he pardons the past for the sake of his brother Divitiacus. He sets spies over Dumnorix, that he may be able to know what he does and with whom he communicates. Chapter 21. Being on the same day informed by his scouts that the enemy had encamped at the foot of a mountain 8 miles from his own camp, he sent persons to ascertain what the nature of the mountain was, and of what kind the ascent on every side. Word was brought back that it was easy. During the 3rd watch he orders Titus Labienus, his lieutenant with praetorian powers, to ascend to the highest ridge of the mountain with 2 legions, and with those as guides who had examined the road. He explains what his plan is. He himself, during the 4th watch, hastens to them by the same route by which the enemy had gone, and sends on all the cavalry before him. Publius Considius, who was reputed to be very experienced in military affairs, and had been in the army of Lucius Sulla, and afterward in that of Marcus Crassus, is sent forward with the scouts. Chapter 22. At daybreak, when the summit of the mountain was in the possession of Titus Labienus, and he himself was not farther off than 1.5 miles from the enemy's camp, nor, as he afterwards ascertained from the captives, had either his arrival or that of Labienus been discovered, Considius, with his horse at full gallop, comes up to him, says that the mountain which he, Caesar, wished should be seized by Labienus is in possession of the enemy, and that he has discovered this by the Gallic arms and ensigns. Caesar leads off his forces to the next hill, and draws them up in battle order. Labienus, as he had been ordered by Caesar not to come to an engagement unless Caesar's own forces were seen near the enemy's camp, that the attack upon the enemy might be made on every side at the same time, was, after having taken possession of the mountain, waiting for our men and refraining from battle. When at length the day was far advanced, Caesar learned through spies that the mountain was in possession of his own men, and that the Helvetii had moved their camp, and that Considius, struck with fear, had reported to him as seen that which he had not seen. On that day he follows the enemy at his usual distance, and pitches his camp 3 miles from theirs. Chapter 23. The next day, as there remained in all only 2 days' space to the time when he must serve out the corn to his army, and as he was not more than 18 miles from Bibracte, by far the largest and best-stored town of the Aedui, he thought that he ought to provide for a supply of corn, and diverted his march from the Helvetii, and advanced rapidly to Bibracte. This circumstance is reported to the enemy by some deserters from Lucius Aemilius, a captain of the Gallic horse. The Helvetii, either because they thought that the Romans, struck with terror, were retreating from them, the more so as the day before, though they had seized on the higher grounds, they had not joined battle, or because they flattered themselves that they might be cut off from the provisions, altering their plan and changing their route, began to pursue and to annoy our men in the rear. Chapter 24. Caesar, when he observes this, draws off his forces to the next hill, and sent the cavalry to sustain the attack of the enemy. He himself, meanwhile, drew up on the middle of the hill a triple line of his 4 veteran legions, in such a manner that he placed above him on the very summit the 2 legions which he had recently levied in hither Gaul, and all the auxiliaries, and he ordered that the whole mountain should be covered with men, and that meanwhile the baggage should be brought together into one place, and the position be protected by those who were posted in the upper line. The Helvetii, having followed with all their wagons, collected their baggage into one place. They themselves, after having repulsed our cavalry and formed a phalanx, advanced up to our front line in very close order. Chapter 25. Caesar, having removed out of sight first his own horse, then those of all, that he might make the danger of all equal, and do away with the hope of flight, after encouraging his men, joined the battle. His soldiers, hurling their javelins from the higher ground, easily broke the enemy's phalanx. That being dispersed, they made a charge on them with drawn swords. It was a great hindrance to the Gauls in fighting, that when several of their bucklers had been by one stroke of the Roman javelins pierced through and pinned fast together, as the point of the iron had bent itself, they could neither pluck it out, nor with their left hand entangled fight with sufficient ease, so that many, after having long tossed their arm about, chose rather to cast away the buckler from their hand, and to fight with their person unprotected. At length, worn out with wounds, they began to give way, and as there was in the neighbourhood a mountain about a mile off, to betake themselves thither. When the mountain had been gained, and our men were advancing up, the Boii and Tulingi, who with about 15,000 men closed the enemy's line of march and served as a guard to their rear, having assailed our men on the exposed flank as they advanced, prepared to surround them. Upon seeing which, the Helvetii, who had betaken themselves to the mountain, began to press on again and renew the battle. The Romans, having faced about, advanced to the attack in 2 divisions, the first and second line to withstand those who had been defeated and driven off the field, the third to receive those who were just arriving. Chapter 26. Thus was the contest long and vigorously carried on with doubtful success. When they could no longer withstand the attacks of our men, the one division, as they had begun to do, betook themselves to the mountain. The other repaired to their baggage and wagons. For during the whole of this battle, although the fight lasted from the 7th hour, i.e., 12 noon to 1 p.m., to eventide, no one could see an enemy with his back turned. The fight was carried on also at the baggage till late in the night, for they had set wagons in the way as a rampart, and from the higher ground kept throwing weapons upon our men, as they came on, and some from between the wagons and the wheels kept darting their lances and javelins from beneath, and wounding our men. After the fight had lasted some time, our men gained possession of their baggage in camp. There the daughter and one of the sons of Orgetorix were taken. After that battle about 130,000 men of the enemy remained alive, who marched incessantly during the whole of that night, and after a march discontinued for no part of the night, arrived in the territories of the Lingones in the 4th day, whilst our men, having stopped for 3 days, both on account of the wounds of the soldiers and the burial of the slain, had not been able to follow them. Caesar sent letters and messengers to the Lingones, with orders that they should not assist them with corn or with anything else, for that if they should assist them, he would regard them in the same light as the Helvetii. After the 3 days' interval, he began to follow them himself with all his forces. Chapter 27. The Helvetii, compelled by the want of everything, sent ambassadors to him about of surrender. When these had met him in the way and had thrown themselves at his feet, and speaking in suppliant tone, had with tears sued for peace, and when he had ordered them to await his arrival in the place where they then were, they obeyed his commands. When Caesar arrived at that place, he demanded hostages, their arms, and the slaves who had deserted to them. Whilst those things are being sought for and got together, after a night's interval, about 6,000 men of that canton which is called the Verbigine, whether terrified by fear, lest after delivering up their arms they should suffer punishment, or else induced by the hope of safety, because they supposed that amid so vast a multitude of those who had surrendered themselves, their flight might either be concealed or entirely overlooked, having at nightfall departed out of the camp of the Helvetii, hastened to the Rhine and the territories of the Germans. Chapter 28. But when Caesar discovered this, he commanded those through whose territories they had gone to seek them out and to bring them back again, if they meant to be acquitted before him, and considered them when brought back in the light of enemies. He admitted all the rest to a surrender, upon their delivering up the hostages, arms, and deserters. He ordered the Helvetii, the Tulingi, and the Latobrigi to return to their territories from which they had come, and as there was at home nothing whereby they might support their hunger, all the productions of the earth having been destroyed, he commanded the Allobrogis to let them have a plentiful supply of corn, and ordered them to rebuild the towns and villages which they had burnt. This he did chiefly on this account, because he was unwilling that the country from which the Helvetii had departed should be untenanted, lest the Germans, who dwell on the other side of the Rhine, should, on account of the excellence of the lands, cross over from their own territories into those of the Helvetii, and become borderers upon the province of Gaul and the Allobrogis. He granted the petition of the Aedui that they might settle the Boii in their own, i.e. in the Aeduan territories, as these were known to be of distinguished valor, to whom they gave lands, and whom they afterwards admitted to the same state of rights and freedom as themselves. Chapter 29. In the camp of the Helvetii, lists were found, drawn up in Greek characters, and were brought to Caesar, in which an estimate had been drawn up, name by name, of the number from which had gone forth from their country, of those who were able to bear arms, and likewise the boys, the old men, and the women separately. All of which items the total was, of the Helvetii, literally of the heads of the Helvetii, 263,000. Of the Tulingi, 36,000. Of the Latobrigi, 14,000. Of the Roraki, 23,000. Of the Boii, 32,000. The sum of all amounted to 368,000. Out of these, such as could bear arms amounted to about 92,000. When the census of those who returned home was taken, as Caesar had commanded, the number was found to be 110,000. Chapter 30. When the war with the Helvetii was concluded, ambassadors from almost all parts of Gaul, the chiefs of states, assembled to congratulate Caesar, saying that they were well aware that, although he had taken vengeance on the Helvetii in war for the old wrongs done by them to the Roman people, yet that circumstance had happened no less to the benefit of the land of Gaul than of the Roman people, because the Helvetii, while their affairs were most flourishing, had quitted their country with the design of making war upon the whole of Gaul, and seizing the government of it, and selecting out of a great abundance that spot for an abode which they should judge to be the most convenient and most productive of all Gaul, and hold the rest of the states as tributaries. They requested that they might be allowed to proclaim an assembly of the whole of Gaul for a particular day, and to do that with Caesar's permission, stating that they had some things which, with the general consent, they wished to ask of him. This request having been granted, they appointed a day for the assembly, and ordained by an oath with each other that no one should disclose their deliberations except those to whom this office should be assigned by the General Assembly.